Tarantino has never cared about what's popular. He cares about what's great. So when he names the only 10 westerns that actually matter, you know it's going to be an interesting list. Some of these Hollywood tried to bury. Some were hated when they came out. And one of them was such a disaster it nearly killed the genre, but Tarantino loved it. This is one of those spaghetti westerns that flies under the radar. Unless you're Tarantino, of course. He loves this one. And for good reason. It's set right after the Civil War, and instead of the usual lone gunslinger, we're following a washed-up Confederate colonel, played by Joseph Cotton, who's got a very bad idea. He and his 3 sons, calling themselves the Hellbenders, are dragging a coffin across the frontier stuffed with stolen cash. The plan is to restart the Confederacy and bring the war back. It's all going great, until of course it isn't. This one's directed by Sergio Corbucci, same guy who made Django. But what makes the Hellbenders so fascinating is that everybody in it is awful. No noble gunslingers, no heroes riding in to save the day, just scheming, backstabbing criminals. And that's exactly why Tarantino loves it. He once said, "The great thing is, this is a Western with no heroes in it. Everybody is the bad guy." An improbable blending of standard Western with pursuits, high body count, and it's fast-moving as well as quite entertaining. This is one of the most influential Westerns ever made. Tarantino's a huge Anthony Mann fan, and out of all his films, he calls this one the best. James Stewart plays a cowboy out for revenge, hunting down the outlaw who wronged him. But what really makes this movie special is the rifle, the titular Winchester 73, which keeps changing hands, passing from one unlucky owner to the next. This was a huge turning point for James Stewart. At the time, his career was floundering. He'd had a string of post-war flops, and this was the movie that saved him. He even gambled on it financially. Since the studio couldn't afford to pay him his full salary, he took a cut of the profits instead. That was unheard of in Hollywood back then, but it worked. Stewart walked away with around $600,000 and basically changed how actors got paid forever. But it wasn't just about money. Stewart committed to this role. He practiced with the rifle until his hands were raw. Anthony Mann later said, "He was magnificent walking down a street with a Winchester cradled in his arm. And he was great too, actually firing the gun. He studied hard at it. His knuckles were raw with practicing. It was those sorts of things that helped make the film look so authentic, gave it its sense of reality." Django is the ultimate spaghetti western. If you only know it from Django Unchained, trust me, you need to see the original. The story follows Django, played by Franco Nero in his first major role. He's an ex-Union soldier dragging a coffin behind him with a Gatling gun in it. He's got a score to settle with a sadistic ex-Confederate officer, Major Jackson, and in true spaghetti western fashion, the body count just skyrockets from there. This movie was massive in Italy. It inspired over 30 unofficial sequels. It's been referenced everywhere, from anime like Fist of the North Star to Red Dead Redemption to punk songs. And Tarantino straight up worships it. He borrowed the music, the typeface, the Django name for Django Unchained, and even gave Franco Nero a cameo.
What's your name?
Django.
Can you spell it?
D-J-A-N-G-O. The D is silent.
I know.
Tarantino once said, "Sergio Corbucci's West was the most violent, surreal, and pitiless landscape of any director in the history of the genre. His characters roam a brutal, sadistic West." If you love Tarantino's westerns, you owe it to yourself to watch this one. Another Sergio Corbucci special. Navajo Joe has Burt Reynolds playing a Native American out for revenge after his tribe is slaughtered. And if that setup sounds like a perfect Tarantino movie, well, he agrees. He's called this one of the greatest revenge films ever made, and he loves how violent, surreal, and merciless Corbucci's vision of the West is. As for Reynolds, Tarantino says he's a one-man tornado onslaught, just tearing through the bad guys with knives, fists, and whatever else is lying around. Apparently, Reynolds even almost broke his neck doing his own stunts. Now, behind the scenes, this movie was a mess. Corbucci thought he was getting Marlon Brando. Reynolds thought he was signing on for a Sergio Leone film. Neither of them got what they expected, and Reynolds hated every second of it. He once joked that the movie was so awful, they only showed it in prisons and airplanes because nobody could leave. Tarantino, though, still put Navajo Joe on his list of favorite spaghetti westerns. He even borrowed from Ennio Morricone's soundtrack, using tracks from it in Kill Bill. So, like it or not, Reynolds did leave his mark on cinema with this one. Tarantino once called Ulzana's Raid his favorite western of the 70s, and it's way more historically accurate than most westerns dared to be at the time. It follows a small cavalry patrol tracking a rogue Apache group, but instead of a full-on battle, what you get is a slow burn, a game of cat and mouse between two forces that are equally determined, but one of them is way more experienced in this kind of warfare. Burt Lancaster plays the frontier scout, a guy clearly based on real-life Apache Wars scout Al Sieber. Director Robert Aldrich wasn't entirely happy with how the final film turned out, but it's still one of his best. Tarantino said, "Ulzana's Raid isn't just a western, it combines the two genres Aldrich was most known for, westerns and war films." And he's right, it's shot like a war movie, structured like a war movie, and it pulls no punches when it comes to the violence. It's not a film for the squeamish. People die in horrific ways, and it doesn't sugarcoat anything about frontier life. Some critics have even called it racist for its portrayal of Native Americans, but at the very least, the movie does attempt to explain the why behind the violence. Django is one of Tarantino's all-time favorite films, and this Japanese take on the spaghetti western is basically Django meets Yojimbo meets whatever the hell Takashi Miike felt like throwing in that day. The movie follows a nameless gunfighter arriving in a lawless town torn between rival gangs. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's because Django itself was loosely inspired by Kurosawa's Yojimbo, which was inspired by Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest. So in a way, Sukiyaki Western Django brings the Western full circle, back to Japan, where it kind of started in the first place. Tarantino himself was thrilled to be a part of it. He said, "I've always loved Japanese films so much, so actually working in a Japanese movie was a dream come true." And of course, he plays a Clint Eastwood-style gunslinger with a raspy voice and a ridiculous accent. Is it historically accurate? Absolutely not. Is it a wild time? Oh yeah. Tarantino isn't exactly known for being a huge John Ford fan, but even he admits Stagecoach is kind of undeniable. This is the movie that made John Wayne a star. Before this, Wayne was just some guy in a bunch of cheap B-movie westerns. But Stagecoach took him to the next level. He plays the Ringo Kid, an outlaw fresh out of prison, joining a group of mismatched travelers on a stagecoach ride through Apache territory. This movie did something really important. It reinvented the Western. Before Stagecoach, Westerns were mostly cheap, throwaway action flicks with paper-thin plots. But John Ford took the genre seriously. The characters actually had depth, the action was intense, and the cinematography was next level. Tarantino even admitted, "I do think a case can be made that Stagecoach was a big jump forward in modern filmmaking. It holds up beautifully today." Wayne later said, "That picture really made me a star." And he wasn't wrong. Without Stagecoach, Wayne might have stayed in the B-movie trenches forever. Instead, he became the face of the Western. One of the earliest revisionist Westerns and a movie way ahead of its time. It takes the classic Western structure and completely flips it, focusing on Native American mistreatment, showing the uglier side of American history, and even throwing in some dark humor to make it all hit even harder. Dustin Hoffman stars as Jack Crabb, a man who grows up with the Cheyenne, later becomes a gunslinger, and eventually serves under General Custer, before realizing that maybe Custer isn't exactly the hero he thought he was. Tarantino has said he's a big fan of this one, even calling it a blood brother to Django Unchained. You can definitely see the connection, the revisionist approach, the way it satirizes Western tropes while still being a Western. The film was originally a passion project for Marlon Brando, who tried and failed to get it made for years before director Arthur Penn finally took it on. And speaking of Penn, he once joked that he was mostly known for making movies about people shooting and cutting each other up, but this one proves he was way more than that. This one's complicated. It's widely considered one of the greatest westerns ever made, but also one of the darkest and most uncomfortable ones to watch. John Wayne plays Ethan Edwards, a Civil War vet who spends years searching for his kidnapped niece. But this isn't some noble rescue mission. His obsession turns ugly, fueled by deep-seated racism and pure, unfiltered hatred. Tarantino has actually criticized parts of The Searchers, but that hasn't stopped him from paying tribute to it. That iconic closing shot, The Searchers. He's recreated it in both Kill Bill and Inglourious Basterds. And if you need proof of how influential this movie is, just look at the directors who swear by it. Scorsese, Spielberg, Lucas, Paul Schrader, John Milius. Even Game of Thrones lifted elements from it for the loot train attack in Season 7. Martin Scorsese once said that what makes The Searchers so shocking is how deep Ethan Edwards' hatred runs. And he's right. This movie lingers with you in a way most classic westerns don't. Everyone remembers The Lone Ranger as an absolute disaster. The thing flopped so hard that Disney wrote off $190 million in losses while it was still in theaters. Westerns are already a tough sell internationally, and this one had a massive budget, somewhere between $225 and $250 million, plus another $150 million for marketing. Tarantino, though, actually loved it. He put it on his top 10 list for 2013, defending it when pretty much no one else would. He thought the action set pieces, especially the train sequences, were way better than people gave them credit for. He wasn't crazy about some of the tonal choices, but overall he thought the movie got way more hate than it deserved.